I sent the message on a Tuesday afternoon right after lunch, while my phone still smelled like sanitizer and bad coffee. Nothing dramatic, just a short note in the family group chat saying I'd been invited to an award ceremony and that it would mean a lot if they came. I added the date, the location, and that it was formal. Then I put the phone down and waited. The typing bubbles showed up almost immediately. That part didn't surprise me. What surprised me was how fast my sister Brooke answered. She didn't ask what the award was. She didn't ask why it mattered. She laughed, not with emojis, with words. She wrote that it was a stupid award and that she didn't have time for things like that. She said she already had tickets to a concert that night and wasn't missing it for some internal military thing. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. The words sat there like they'd been waiting for permission to hurt. A few seconds later, my mom chimed in. She said she understood Brooke's point. These ceremonies were always last minute, she said. Hard to plan around. Then my dad added his contribution, which somehow made it worse without being longer. He wrote, "Don't blame us if we don't go." I read that line twice. Don't blame us. Like I'd ask them to pick me up from the airport. Like this was an errand. Like it was something inconvenient I should have known better than to ask for. I typed a response. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. I thought about explaining what the award was connected to. I thought about saying I couldn't talk about details, but that it mattered. I thought about pointing out that I didn't ask for much. All of that sat in my head, fully formed, ready to go. Instead, I typed one word. All right, that was it. No punctuation, no follow-up. I hit send and locked my phone. Right there is where I'll pause for one quick second. If you've ever had a moment like that with family, where you realized exactly where you stand, drop a comment below and tell me what word you didn't say. And if stories like this sound familiar, subscribing helps more than you think. All right. Back to it. I didn't feel angry right away. That came later. At first, I felt calm in a way that almost scared me, like something had settled into place, like a door had closed quietly and without ceremony. For context, my family thinks they know what I do for a living. They know I'm in the Navy. They know I work in an office most days. What they don't know is what that office actually does. I've never corrected them when they called it logistics or paperwork or some admin role, not because I was embarrassed, but because I wasn't allowed to explain, and over time it just stopped feeling worth the effort. So when Brooke threw out that comment about a stupid award, it fit neatly into the version of me they'd already decided on. Safe job, small role, nothing headline-worthy. The thing is, the invitation wasn't vague. It didn't say participation award or team luncheon. It came with a schedule, security instructions, and a list of people I wasn't supposed to talk to beforehand. It came from a department email address most people wouldn't recognize, but everyone inside the building would. It came after months of silence and reviews I hadn't been allowed to discuss with anyone outside work. But none of that mattered in the group chat. What mattered was that Brooke had plans, and my parents didn't feel like pushing back. I set the phone face down on the counter and finished my coffee. I had a briefing in 40 minutes and a stack of notes that still needed review. Whatever reaction I'd hoped for from my family, I'd gotten my answer. Later that night, I replayed the exchange in my head while packing for the ceremony. I wasn't packing a gown or anything dramatic, just a dark dress that fit regulations and didn't draw attention. The kind of thing you wear when you don't want to be memorable, just present. I wondered briefly if I should have phrased the invitation differently. Maybe I should have emphasized the formality. Maybe I should have said it was important to my command. Maybe I should have asked instead of told. Then I remembered that I had asked, politely, clearly, and the answer had been laughter. The next morning, Brooke sent a follow-up message in the chat. She joked about how I'd probably get another certificate to hang in my office. She added that she hoped I'd have fun playing dress-up. No one told her to stop. I didn't reply. At work, the day moved the way days always do. Meetings, secure rooms, conversations that stopped when doors opened. Nobody there laughed when they mentioned the ceremony. Nobody called it stupid. Nobody treated it like a favor I was asking for. By the time I left the building, my phone had buzzed again. My mom asked if the ceremony was going to be recorded. She said maybe they could watch part of it later, if they had time. I didn't answer that either. That night, I laid the dress out on the chair and set my alarm earlier than usual. I checked the address again, then checked it a second time, just to be sure. The event wasn't downtown, but close enough that traffic could get messy. I added extra time. Before bed, I picked up my phone one last time. The group chat was quiet. No apologies. No change of plans. Just the messages sitting there, exactly as they'd been sent. I put the phone on the nightstand face down again and turned off the light. Somewhere across town, Brooke was probably checking her concert tickets, thinking about parking and merch lines. My parents were probably deciding what time to leave the house and whether to eat beforehand. None of them knew what the next 24 hours would bring. Not because I had planned anything, not because I was trying to prove a point. Just because some things don't wait for permission to be understood. I fell asleep faster than I expected, with the word, "all right," still echoing in my head. Not as acceptance, but as a line I wasn't going to cross back over. I woke up before my alarm and lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle the way it always did right before morning. My phone was still face down on the nightstand, exactly where I'd left it, and I didn't flip it over. I already knew nothing had changed. Getting dressed felt automatic. Navy mornings usually do. Shirt, shoes, keys. Muscle memory handled the basics, while my head stayed somewhere else, stuck on the way Brooke had laughed, like it was a punchline everyone was supposed to get. That laugh wasn't new. It just sounded the same way it always had. Growing up, our family had a system, even if no one ever admitted it out loud. Brooke was the center. Everything else rotated around her. Her schedule decided dinner times. Her moods decided the temperature of the room. If Brooke had something going on, it mattered. If I did, it was nice. Appreciated. Optional. I learned that difference early. When Brooke had a school play the whole week, was about rehearsals and costumes. When I had a science fair, my dad asked how it went while he was tying his shoes. If Brooke had a bad day, everyone adjusted. If I did, I learned to handle it quietly. No one told me to be invisible. I just noticed when it was convenient. At family gatherings, relatives asked Brooke what she was up to before their coats were even off. They asked about her job, her plans, her latest idea. By the time the questions made their way to me, the conversation had already drifted. Someone needed another drink. Someone wanted dessert. I didn't resent her for it. Not then. I told myself it was just how families worked. Someone always talked louder. Someone always needed more space. My parents liked to say I was independent, low maintenance, easy. They said it like it was a compliment, and I accepted it because pushing back felt unnecessary. Independence came with fewer expectations, fewer disappointments. When I told them I was joining the Navy, Brooke reacted the way she reacted to most things that weren't about her. Mild interest, a quick joke. She said something about uniforms and rules, and asked if I'd get seasick. My mom worried about safety. My dad nodded and said it sounded stable. Stable. That word followed me for years. At holidays, Brooke's career was described as exciting, dynamic, full of potential. Mine was described as steady, reliable, a good fallback. Nobody asked what I actually did. When they did, I gave the safest answer possible. Analysis, support, office work. That answer stuck. Over time, it hardened into a version of me they all agreed on. I was the one with benefits and structure, the one who didn't take risks, the one who worked behind a desk while other people did the interesting stuff. I stopped correcting them because correcting them never changed anything. It just slowed the conversation down. When Brooke talked about her work, she got reactions. Sympathy when things were hard. Applause when things went well. When I mentioned something stressful, my mom would say, Well, at least you have job security. That was usually the end of it. It wasn't cruelty. It was something quieter than that. Familiar, comfortable. At some point, I realized my role wasn't to be celebrated. It was to be counted on. If something needed handling, I handled it. If a form needed signing, I reminded them. If a plan fell apart, I adjusted. Being useful earned me a kind of trust that didn't require attention. Brooke, on the other hand, was allowed to take up space. She was allowed to change her mind. She was allowed to fail loudly and recover publicly. Every shift in her life became a family event. I learned to watch rather than compete. When people ask why I don't talk much about my work, I usually say it's habit. That's part of it. The other part is that for a long time, I learned nothing good came from trying to stand in the same light as my sister. The light was already claimed. Anything I brought into it just looked smaller by comparison. The Navy fit that version of me in ways I didn't expect. Clear roles, clear expectations. You did your job, and if you did it well, someone noticed. Not everyone, just the people who needed to. That was enough. At home, none of that translated. If I came back on leave, Brooke would ask if I was still doing the same thing. My dad would ask when I planned to settle somewhere permanently. My mom would ask if I was eating well. No one asked what I was proud of. So when I sent that message about the award, it wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about presence. About whether they'd show up when it wasn't easy or familiar or centered on Brooke. Their answer told me more than the words themselves. I grabbed my bag and headed out the door, the cool air snapping me awake the rest of the way. Driving to work, I thought about how many times I'd accepted being the background without questioning it. How often I'd chosen quiet because it felt simpler. At a red light, my phone buzzed again. I didn't pick it up. I already knew it would be something casual. A joke. A deflection. Brooke had a way of softening insults after the fact, turning them into misunderstandings if anyone pushed back. The light turned green. I drove on. By the time I parked, the feeling in my chest had shifted. It wasn't hurt anymore. It was clarity. The kind that doesn't feel dramatic, but changes how you stand. Inside the building, everything ran on routine. Badges scanned. Doors locked behind me. Conversations stayed clipped and professional. Here, nobody assumed they knew my limits based on how quiet I was. Nobody confused silence with lack of impact. I sat down at my desk and opened the first report of the day. Lines of text scrolled past, familiar and precise. This was work that didn't ask for applause. It just asked for attention. As I read, I realized something I hadn't fully admitted before. I wasn't upset that my family didn't understand my job. I was upset that they never tried, that they decided who I was years ago and never updated the file. Brooke's comment hadn't hurt because it was sharp. It hurt because it was predictable. I closed the report, took a breath, and reached for my notebook. There was a lot to get through before the day ended, and none of it would wait for family opinions. The ceremony was coming whether they believed in it or not. And for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to make them believe anything at all. I slid my badge into the reader and waited for the soft click that meant the door had accepted me. It always took half a second longer than I expected, just enough time to remind me that access wasn't assumed here. You earned it every day. Inside, the lights were already on. A couple of people were at their desks, jackets draped over chairs, coffee cooling untouched. No greetings louder than a nod. No small talk. We didn't waste energy on things that didn't move the work forward. This was the part of my life my family never saw and never asked to see. Naval intelligence isn't dramatic in the way movies like to pretend it is. There are no blinking maps or shouted countdowns. Most days it's quiet, controlled. You read, you cross-check, you question patterns that look harmless until they don't. You learn how to sit with uncertainty without rushing to fill it in. My job sat at the intersection of analysis and decision support. I wasn't the one giving orders, and I wasn't the one carrying them out. I was the one expected to notice what everyone else missed before it turned into a problem someone else had to solve under pressure. It took time to get there. When I first joined the unit, I was the newest person in the room, more often than not. Younger, quieter, female in a space where nobody said that mattered, but everyone noticed anyway. I didn't stand out, and that worked in my favor. People talked freely around me. They assumed I was there to take notes. I did take notes, just not the kind they expected. The early months were about learning what not to say, what not to repeat, how to phrase a concern without sounding like an accusation. Intelligence work isn't about being right loudly. It's about being precise at the exact moment someone is willing to listen. I learned fast. There were nights when I stayed late because something in a report didn't sit right, a detail that technically fit but felt off, a gap that wasn't big enough to flag on its own, but didn't line up with what we'd seen the week before. I learned to trust that instinct without overselling it. That's not something you explain easily at family dinner. When my mom asked what I did all day, I said I analyzed data. When my dad asked who I worked with, I said a team. When Brooke joked that I must be good at spreadsheets by now, I smiled and let it land. Correcting them would have meant explaining why I couldn't correct them. It was easier to let the misunderstanding settle in. Inside the building, nobody misunderstood what was at stake. There was a senior analyst who used to stop by my desk without warning. He never stayed long. He'd ask one question, listen to my answer, and leave. No feedback, no praise. The first time he did it, I assumed I'd messed something up. A few weeks later, he did it again. Same pattern. Then again. Eventually, someone told me that was his way of checking whether you were paying attention to the right things. If he stopped coming by, that's when you worried. He never stopped. I didn't tell my family about the nights I drove home replaying scenarios in my head, wondering if I'd pushed hard enough on a point, or if I'd let something slide because I didn't want to sound alarmist. I didn't tell them about the tension that came from knowing your work mattered, even if your name never left the room. At home, the story stayed small. Brooke once asked if I ever thought about switching to something more visible. She said it casually like advice, like she was doing me a favor. I told her I was where I needed to be. She laughed and said she could never work somewhere no one knew what she did. That was the point. In intelligence, visibility usually means something went wrong. As the months passed, my responsibilities expanded, not in big announcements, just in quiet additions. I was looped into conversations earlier, asked for input before conclusions were drafted. Given data sets that hadn't been fully scrubbed yet, which was a sign of trust. I learned how to brief without theatrics, how to present findings in a way that respected the chain of command and the time of the people listening. You didn't tell them what to think. You showed them what you saw and why it mattered. There was a moment about a year in when a decision went out that aligned exactly with a concern I'd raised days earlier. Nobody referenced my name. Nobody needed to. The adjustment happened. The risk narrowed. That was the reward. I left the building that night feeling the kind of tired that doesn't come from hours, but from holding responsibility without sharing it. The kind that makes silence feel heavy instead of peaceful. At home, my phone lit up with a message from Brooke asking if I'd be around for the holidays. She wanted to know early so she could plan. I said yes. She reacted with a thumbs up and nothing else. There was no part of that exchange where it made sense to mention the work I'd just done. The disconnect grew slowly, like things usually do. My world expanded inward, deeper into systems and assessments, and decisions that never made the news. My family's image of me stayed flat, unchanged from the version they'd settled on years ago. I didn't mind most days. It was easier to exist without expectations than to constantly adjust them. But there were moments, usually late at night, when I wondered what it would be like to be seen clearly without having to explain myself. Not praised, just understood. Those thoughts stayed in my head where they belonged. When the first email came through asking for background on a project I'd worked on, I assumed it was routine. Requests like that happened all the time. Clarifications, documentation, another layer of review. I answered the questions carefully, sticking to approved language. I forwarded the request to the right people. I went back to what I'd been doing. A week later, another email followed. Different sender, same topic, more detailed questions. That got my attention. I didn't tell my family about that either. Not because it was secret, but because at that point, it still didn't feel real. Things inside this world only mattered once they reached a certain threshold. Until then, you treated them like background noise and kept working. That habit had served me well. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the screen lines of text filling the space where certainty usually lived. Whatever this was turning into, it wasn't something I could explain over dinner or in a group chat. It wasn't something Brooke would recognize as important until someone else labeled it that way. I straightened up, pulled the file closer, and started reading again. There was work to do, and whether anyone at home understood it or not didn't change the standard I held myself to. I noticed the mistake because the numbers were too clean. That was the first thing that bothered me. The data lined up in a way that looked impressive at a glance, like someone had smoothed out the edges to make the picture easier to sell. I leaned closer to the screen and scrolled back, checking the source tags. Same feed, same time window, different assumptions. I didn't say anything right away. In intelligence, timing matters as much as accuracy. You don't interrupt just because you're uncomfortable. You interrupt when you're sure. By the time I raised my hand, the room had already moved on to the next slide. I cleared my throat and asked them to pull the previous data set back up. No accusation. Just a question about why one variable had been weighted differently. The room went quiet in that way it does when people realize they may have missed something. 10 minutes later, the recommendation changed. Nobody said my name. Nobody needed to. The adjustment was logged and the meeting continued. That was how it worked. You didn't collect credit. You reduced risk. Afterward, one of the analysts stopped by my desk and nodded once. "Good catch," he said, already turning away. That was the entire conversation. I sat there for a moment, hands resting on the keyboard, feeling the familiar mix of relief and tension. Relief that we'd caught it in time. Tension from knowing how close it had come to slipping through. This was the cost of staying silent. You carried the weight without the outlet. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from my mom asking if I'd be home for my cousin's birthday dinner. I typed yes and added that I might be late. She replied with a thumbs up and a reminder to bring dessert if I had time. There was a strange whiplash in switching between those worlds. 1 minute, you're adjusting something that could change how resources move across a region. The next, you're being asked to pick up a cake. I didn't mind the contrast most days. It kept me grounded. But sometimes it made the silence feel heavier than it needed to be. At the dinner, Brooke dominated the conversation the way she always did. She talked about a project at work that had gone sideways, about how exhausting it was to manage people who didn't know what they were doing. Everyone listened. My dad asked follow-up questions. My mom shook her head sympathetically. When someone asked how my job was going, Brooke jumped in before I could answer. She joked that I probably couldn't talk about it anyway, that it was all classified spreadsheets and meetings. I smiled and said it was fine, busy. That was all it took to move the conversation on. No one noticed the way my jaw tightened when Brooke said classified spreadsheets like it was a punchline. No one noticed because they weren't looking. I excused myself early, citing an early morning. In the car, I sat with the engine off for a few seconds, hands on the steering wheel staring through the windshield. I wasn't angry. I was tired in a way sleep didn't fix. The next week brought another long stretch of late nights. A developing situation overseas meant more eyes on our section, more requests for rapid assessments. The work sped up, and with it came a different kind of pressure. There's no applause when things go right, but there's always a record when they don't. One evening, I caught myself rereading the same paragraph for the third time. I pushed back from the desk and rubbed my eyes. That was when the thought crept in uninvited and unwelcome. What if I said something just once? Not the details, not the sensitive parts, just enough to change the picture they had of me. I dismissed it almost immediately. That wasn't how this worked. You didn't reshape your life around other people's assumptions. You did your job and trusted that it mattered, even if the people closest to you never saw it. Still, the thought lingered. The silence wasn't neutral anymore. It was starting to feel like a choice I was making for everyone else's comfort. A few days later, I got an email asking me to sit in on a briefing I hadn't been scheduled for. It wasn't a big deal on paper, just an extra set of eyes. But it meant my work was being pulled into a different conversation, one that sat a level higher than where I usually operated. I went. I listened. I answered when asked. After the meeting, my supervisor told me to stay behind. He didn't say much, just that leadership had been paying attention to how certain pieces fit together, and that consistency mattered. I nodded and went back to my desk. That night, Brooke called while I was heating up leftovers. She wanted to complain about our parents being difficult about holiday plans. She talked for 10 minutes without stopping building momentum as she went. I made the right noises at the right times. At one point, she paused and asked if I ever felt bored at work. She said she couldn't imagine doing the same thing every day without any recognition. I looked at the microwave counting down and said no. I wasn't bored. She laughed and said I was lucky to be so easygoing. After we hung up, I stood there holding a plate that had gone cold. The word easygoing stuck with me longer than it should have. It sounded like another way of saying forgettable. The next morning, I caught a small error in a draft that had already been cleared by 2 other sections. It wasn't dramatic, just a misalignment in how a risk factor had been interpreted. Fixing it meant sending the document back and delaying a decision by a few hours. I sent the note anyway. Later, someone thanked me for being thorough. They said it like a habit they'd come to rely on. That was when it hit me. The silence wasn't just protecting the work. It was protecting the version of me my family found easiest to understand. The one who didn't complicate things. The one who didn't need space. At lunch, I sat alone with my notebook open, not writing anything. I wasn't thinking about the ceremony or the award. I was thinking about how long I'd been shrinking my own story to fit other people's comfort. By the time I got home that evening, there was a new email waiting in my inbox. The subject line referenced a project I'd worked on months earlier. The body of the message was brief, asking for confirmation on a few points and availability for follow-up questions. I read it twice, feeling that familiar flicker of attention shift. At home, my phone buzzed again. A message from my mom reminding me to RSVP for an upcoming family event. I didn't answer right away. I set the phone down, opened my laptop, and pulled the email back up. The cost of staying silent had always been manageable before. Lately, it was starting to feel heavier, like something that demanded a decision instead of patience. I took a breath and began typing careful, with every word, fully aware that some things change, not because you announce them, but because you finally stop pretending they don't matter. I almost deleted the email without opening it. Not because I thought it was spam or a mistake, but because I recognized the sender's domain immediately and felt that familiar tightening in my chest. Messages from that address didn't come often, and when they did, they usually meant more work, not congratulations. I opened it anyway. The wording was careful and dry, the way official messages tend to be. It thanked me for my contributions to a recent project and said the review committee had requested additional information. There was no mention of awards, no hint of outcomes, just a list of questions and a deadline. I answered them the same way I answered everything else. Direct, precise, within bounds. Then I forwarded the thread to the appropriate internal contacts and moved on with my day. That should have been the end of it. A week later, another message came in. Different name, same topic. This time, the questions weren't about process. They were about impact, how decisions had shifted, what changed as a result, what risks had been avoided. That made me pause. I didn't tell anyone at home, not my parents, not Brooke. I'd learned the hard way that sharing half-formed things only invited opinions that didn't help. Until something was real, it stayed inside the building. At work, the tone around me shifted in ways that were easy to miss. If you weren't paying attention, people looped me into emails earlier than usual, asked for input before final drafts instead of after. It wasn't praise, it was trust. One afternoon, my supervisor stopped by and asked if I had a few minutes. We stepped into an empty room and closed the door. He told me there had been a nomination tied to a joint review process and that my name had come up more than once. He didn't say for what. He didn't say how far it would go. He told me not to read into it and to keep doing what I'd been doing. That advice sounded familiar. I did exactly that. I kept my head down and my work clean. I didn't check my inbox more than usual. I didn't speculate with coworkers. Speculation wastes time, and time was already tight. When the official invitation finally arrived, it didn't feel dramatic. It felt dense. The attachment alone was several pages long, filled with instructions, schedules, and security reminders. The language was formal, almost stiff, but my name was there, spelled correctly attached to something that couldn't be brushed off as internal housekeeping. I read it twice. Then a third time slower. It wasn't a parade. It wasn't a headline event. It was a formal recognition tied to a broader ceremony with multiple recipients from different units. Some details were redacted. Others were summarized in a way that said everything and nothing at the same time. It was real. I forwarded the email to my supervisor and the public affairs contact listed in the packet. They replied with a brief acknowledgement and a reminder not to discuss specifics outside approved channels. Standard procedure. Nothing celebratory. Still, the weight of it followed me home. As the date got closer, the ceremony became something I prepared for professionally, not emotionally. I reviewed the schedule. I confirmed transportation. I read the background notes provided for attendees, making sure I didn't miss anything that could complicate the day. The fact that my family wasn't coming became another logistical detail. Not a crisis, not a betrayal, just information. Still, there was a part of me that noticed the quiet. Not the quiet of secrecy, the quiet of realization. I'd invited them because that felt like the right thing to do, not because I needed them there. Their reaction stripped away whatever hope I'd attached to the gesture without me fully realizing it was there. The ceremony wasn't about validation. It was about acknowledgement from people who understood the work. People who didn't need it, explained in simpler terms. That understanding settled in slowly, like a shift in posture, rather than a sudden change of heart. The night before the ceremony, I laid out what I'd wear and set my alarm earlier than usual. I checked the address again and confirmed the route. Everything was where it needed to be. Before turning in, I glanced at my phone. The group chat was quiet again. No reconsideration, no apology, no follow-up questions. I turned the phone face down and left it there. Somewhere else in the city, Brooke was probably finalizing her concert plans. My parents were likely thinking about traffic and parking and whether to eat before they left. None of that touched what I was preparing for. I shut the laptop, turned off the light, and focused on the practical details ahead. Whatever the ceremony turned out to be, it wasn't something I needed my family to take seriously for it to matter. I adjusted the collar once, then stopped myself from touching it again. The mirror didn't need another check. Everything was where it was supposed to be. That was the point of uniforms and rules and schedules. You prepared so you didn't have to think about yourself when it mattered. Downstairs, the lobby was already busy. Security checkpoints funneled people into neat lines. Badges were checked, names, confirmed phones briefly held and returned. Conversations stayed low and polite. No one was nervous, or if they were, they hid it well. I followed the instructions exactly as written. Stand here, wait there, move when told. The The ceremony ran on coordination, not improvisation. Inside the ballroom, rows of chairs faced a modest stage. Nothing flashy, no dramatic lighting. Just a podium, a screen, and a few flags positioned with careful symmetry. This wasn't a spectacle. It was a process. I found my seat among people I recognized from meetings and briefings. Some nodded. A few smiled. No one made a big deal out of it. That helped. The program started on time. An official welcomed everyone and spoke in measured tones about service responsibility and outcomes that don't make headlines. The screen behind him cycled through names and titles as different groups were acknowledged. I focused on my breathing and the feel of the chair beneath me. This wasn't about performance. It was about being present and not getting in the way. When my name appeared on the screen, it looked strange, familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. I stood when prompted, walked to the stage, accepted the plaque, shook hands, and posed briefly for a photo I hadn't asked for. The applause was polite, controlled. Then it was over. I returned to my seat and listened to the rest of the program, my thoughts moving slower than usual. Somewhere across town, Brooke was probably finding her section, weaving through the crowd with her ticket held high. My parents were likely settling into their seats, making comments about the opening act. They weren't thinking about me. I knew that. And for the first time, it didn't bother me. After the ceremony, people filtered out in small groups. There were handshakes and quiet congratulations. Someone mentioned that a local station had picked up footage for a short segment. Another person joked about hoping the camera angles were forgiving. I didn't think much of it. By the time I stepped outside, the air had cooled. I checked my phone for the first time since arriving. A couple of messages from work contacts, nothing from my family. I ordered a ride and waited near the curb watching cars slide past. The city looked the same as it always did. Neon signs flickered in the distance. Traffic moved in fits and starts. My ride arrived and I slid into the back seat, finally allowing myself to exhale fully. Halfway home, my phone buzzed again. Then again, and again. I glanced down. Missed calls, text notifications, the family group chat lighting up in rapid succession. I didn't open it right away. When I did, the first message was from my mom. She asked if I was okay. The second said they'd just seen something unexpected. The third came from my dad asking why strangers were looking at them. Then Brooke's message landed. She wrote that my face had appeared on the big screens at the concert venue. She said people around them had started whispering. Someone behind them had read my name out loud. Another person had asked if they were related to me. She added a line about how wild it was, how she hadn't known, how nobody had known. I sat there, phone resting in my palm, watching the city pass by the window. The timing was almost too precise. The segment must have run during a break between sets. The venue was known for rotating live feeds and local highlights between performances. Nobody planned that. It just happened. My mom's next message said people nearby had started asking questions. What did she do? Where did she work? Why hadn't they mentioned it before? My dad wrote that he hadn't known what to say, that he'd laughed it off at first, that it had felt awkward. Brooke sent another message, this one shorter. She said she didn't realize the award was that kind of thing. I thought back to the way she'd laughed in the group chat, the ease of it, the confidence, the way she'd closed the door without checking what was on the other side. I didn't respond. The ride pulled up to my building, and I paid without looking at the receipt. Inside my apartment, the silence felt different than it usually did. Less empty, more intentional. I set the plaque on the counter and kicked off my shoes. The phone kept buzzing. More messages came in. My mom said she was proud. My dad said it must have been an important night. Brooke said she wished she'd known. That last one sat there longer than the rest. Known what, I wondered? That it mattered, that other people would see it, that strangers would recognize something she hadn't bothered to ask about. I moved through the apartment, changing clothes, washing my hands, doing normal things while the conversation unfolded without me. The shift in tone was unmistakable. Shock turning into pride, Paris edging towards something else. By the time I sat down on the couch, the messages had slowed. The initial surprise had burned off, leaving behind questions, curiosity, a sudden interest that hadn't existed hours earlier. I scrolled back up, reading the thread from the beginning. The laughter, the dismissal, the plans that mattered more. None of it had changed. The screen at the concert hadn't erased those lines. It had just added new ones on top. I locked the phone and set it aside. Outside, the city kept doing what it always did. Music thumped somewhere in the distance. Traffic hummed. People moved from place to place without knowing anything about my night or my family's. Inside, I felt steady. Not vindicated, not angry, just clear. Whatever my family was feeling now wasn't about understanding the work or respecting the silence it required. It was about being seen by other people and realizing they'd missed something that could no longer be minimized. I stood up and moved the plaque to a shelf where it wouldn't catch my eye every time I walked past. It didn't need to be front and center to exist. The phone buzzed again. This time I picked it up, read the latest message without reacting, and placed it face down on the table the same way I had when all of this started. Some realizations arrive loudly under bright lights and crowded rooms. Others settle in quietly after the noise fades when you finally understand which moments mattered and which ones didn't need an audience at all. I woke up to my phone vibrating against the nightstand, not ringing, just buzzing in short bursts like it was trying not to be rude. I didn't reach for it right away. I already knew who it would be. When I finally picked it up, the screen was a stack of missed calls and messages, all from the same names. The tone had shifted overnight. The shock from the concert had worn off, replaced by something more organized. My mom's messages came first. She said she hadn't slept much. She said she kept thinking about how surprised she'd been, how proud she felt. She asked how I was feeling and whether I'd eaten after the ceremony. My dad followed with shorter texts. He said people at the concert had asked questions he hadn't known how to answer. He said it was impressive. He said he wished he'd known sooner. Then there was Brooke. Her messages were different, polished, careful. She said she'd looked up the award after the show. She said she didn't realize it was such a big deal. She added that she'd told a few people I was her sister and that they'd been impressed. That last part stuck. I got out of bed and made coffee, letting the phone sit where it was. The smell filled the kitchen, familiar and grounding. Outside, the morning moved along like nothing unusual had happened. People walked dogs, cars backed out of driveways. Life kept its schedule. By the time I sat down with my mug, more messages had come in. My mom asked if reporters might reach out. She said someone from her neighborhood group had already mentioned seeing a clip online. My dad wondered if the Navy would want to do a follow-up story. Brooke suggested posting an old photo of us together. She said it would be nice for context. She asked which picture I liked best. I scrolled through the thread slowly, not rushing, not reacting. The words were upbeat now, supportive, proud. The same people who'd brushed off the invitation were suddenly eager to participate. I thought back to the way Brooke had laughed when I sent the message, the way she'd closed the conversation without a second thought. That hadn't been confusion. It had been certainty. The certainty was gone now. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I opened my email and skimmed through work messages. A couple of notes from colleagues. One brief congratulatory line from someone I respected, followed by a question about next week's briefing. Normal, grounded. The contrast helped. When I did go back to the family chat, I noticed something else. The language had shifted from you to we. We're so proud. We didn't realize. We always knew you were doing important work. Always knew. That phrase sat wrong. I didn't correct it. I didn't need to. The scroll history was still there, and the people most invested in ignoring it were the ones typing now. Around mid-morning, my mom called again. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message saying she understood if I was busy, but that she hoped we could talk soon. She said she felt bad about missing the ceremony. She said she wanted to make it right. I replayed that part once, then stopped. Making it right apparently meant being included now that other people were watching. Brooke tried a different approach. She sent a direct message instead of using the group chat. She said she hadn't meant to hurt my feelings. She said she'd thought the award was just internal recognition and hadn't realized it would be public. She added that she'd told her friends I worked in intelligence and that they thought it was kind of cool. Kind of cool. After the fact. I set the phone down and stared at the wall for a few seconds, letting the irritation pass without grabbing onto it. I wasn't angry in the way people expect anger to look. There was no heat, just a tightening like something drawing a clear line. Later that day, my mom sent another message saying a local station might be interested in talking to the family about what it was like to raise someone in the military. She said it could be a good opportunity, positive, respectful. That was the moment it clicked. This wasn't about reconciliation. It wasn't even about pride. It was about narrative, about being associated with something impressive without having to engage with it when it required effort. I stood up and walked around the apartment, phone in hand, replaying the timeline in my head. The invitation, the laughter, the dismissal, the concert, the screens, the questions from strangers, the sudden shift. None of it felt accidental anymore. I sat back down and opened the family chat again, scrolling past the new messages to the ones from earlier in the week. The contrast was stark. No amount of enthusiasm could smooth over that gap. At work, people respected silence. At home, silence had been interpreted as emptiness. My phone buzzed again, Brooke this time asking if I'd seen her message. She added that she was just trying to help and didn't understand why I was being distant. Distant. As if the distance hadn't been there long before the ceremony. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened my calendar and looked at the next few days. Meetings, briefings, deadlines. Things that would happen regardless of how my family felt. That steadiness mattered more than whatever emotional wave they were riding now. By the afternoon, the messages slowed. Not because they'd lost interest, but because they were waiting. Waiting for me to respond. Waiting for permission to move forward with the version of events they preferred. I realized something then that I hadn't fully acknowledged before. Their pride wasn't late because they'd missed the ceremony. It was late because it had always been conditional. Conditional on visibility. Conditional on approval from outside sources. Conditional on being easy to understand. I picked up my phone and typed a reply, then stopped. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that, too. The instinct to smooth things over was still their muscle memory from years of playing the role that kept everyone comfortable. But the comfort had always come at my expense. I locked the screen without sending anything and set the phone down. The apartment felt quiet, but not empty. The kind of quiet that gives you room to think without interruption. I took another sip of coffee, now lukewarm, and let my shoulders relax. Outside, the day went on. Somewhere, Brooke was probably refreshing her feed, waiting to see if I'd engage. My parents were likely telling the story again, adjusting details with each retelling. None of that required my participation. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel guilty. I felt resolved in a way that didn't need validation. Family pride, when it arrives this late, doesn't feel like support. It feels like a hand reaching out only after the spotlight turns on. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to take it. I didn't answer anyone that night. I set the phone on the counter, face down, and left it there while I washed a single plate that didn't need washing. My hands needed something to do while my head caught up. The next morning, I brought the issue to work instead of letting it sit. Not to complain, not to vent. I asked for 10 minutes with our public affairs officer, the same way you ask about clearance language or media protocol. Routine, professional. Her office was small and windowless, stacked with binders, and a whiteboard full of notes from briefings that never made the news. She listened without interrupting while I explained sticking to facts. Family, messages, public attention I hadn't invited. Pressure to participate. She nodded once and asked a couple of clarifying questions. Not about my feelings, about scope. Who had contacted whom? What had been shared? Whether anyone had asked to speak on my behalf. When I finished, she leaned back and said something simple. You don't owe anyone access. She didn't tell me what to say. She didn't draft a response. She reminded me that boundaries weren't a personal failing. They were part of the job. I left her office lighter than I'd walked in. At my desk, I pulled up the family chat and read through the messages again, this time without the emotional noise. Patterns stood out more clearly when I wasn't reacting. The shift in tone, the sudden urgency, the way everything was framed as concern while still centering their needs. I didn't need to argue with that. I needed to define limits. I typed slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted the words to stand on their own without explanation. No backstory, no justification, just the line. I said I wasn't comfortable with anyone speaking publicly about my work or my career. I said I wouldn't be participating in interviews or features that involved my personal life. I asked that they not contact my unit, my colleagues, or anyone connected to my job. I added one more sentence. I said it hurt to see something dismissed when it was private and claimed when it became visible. I didn't quote Brooke. I didn't reference the group chat earlier in the week. The record didn't need help. I read it once more and hit send. The typing bubbles appeared almost immediately. My mom replied first. Her message came in a block long and careful. She said she understood my need for privacy. She said they were just excited. She said they were proud in their own way, and that I might be reading too much into things. My dad followed with a shorter response. He said he didn't appreciate being told what he could or couldn't say about his own daughter. He said they had supported me the best they knew how. Brooke didn't send one long message. She sent several short ones back to back. She said I was overreacting. She said I was embarrassing the family. She said I was acting like they'd done something unforgivable when it was just a misunderstanding. The word misunderstanding landed with a dull thud. I didn't respond. That was the hardest part. Not sending another message, not clarifying, not softening the edge to keep things comfortable. I could feel the old instinct pulling at me, the urge to smooth things over before they escalated. I stayed still. At work, the day unfolded normally. Briefings, updates, a quick exchange with a colleague about an upcoming assessment. Nobody mentioned the ceremony. Nobody asked about my family. The world I trusted continued to operate on facts and follow-through. During lunch, I muted the family chat. Not blocked, not deleted. Muted! The messages would still arrive, but they wouldn't interrupt my day. The quiet that followed was immediate. Later that afternoon, Brooke tried again, this time through a different channel. She sent a message saying she didn't recognize me lately. She said she felt shut out and accused me of choosing my job over family. I stared at that one longer than the others. I had chosen my job many times. Chosen it over convenience, over comfort, over being understood. What I hadn't chosen was being reduced to something small so other people wouldn't have to adjust their image of me. I didn't reply. That evening, my mom left a voicemail. She said she was worried. She said she didn't like the distance. She asked when we could talk things through. I listened to it once and archived it. None of this felt dramatic. There was no shouting, no confrontation. Just a series of doors closing quietly because they no longer led anywhere healthy. The next day, I noticed something subtle shift. Fewer messages, longer gaps between them. The pressure eased not because they agreed, but because they realized I wasn't going to engage on the terms they wanted. At work, I met with a junior analyst who had questions about a report she was preparing. We talked through it step by step. She listened closely, asked smart questions, and adjusted her approach without defensiveness. Before she left, she thanked me for taking the time. She said it helped to know where the line was and why it mattered. I thought about that later driving home. How clarity, when offered calmly, tends to do that. It creates space instead of conflict. Back at the apartment, I made dinner and ate standing at the counterphone, untouched on the other side of the room. The absence of constant buzzing felt strange at first, then normal. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. For years, I'd believed keeping the peace meant staying quiet. That silence was the price of belonging. What I was learning now was that peace built on erasing yourself isn't peace at all. It's compliance. The boundary didn't change my family. It changed my access to the version of them that only showed up when it benefited them. As the night went on, I checked my calendar for the next day and set my alarm. The routines that mattered stayed in place. The work continued. The standards didn't shift just because the personal side of my life had. Before bed, I glanced at the phone once more. No new messages, no apologies, no breakthroughs. That was fine. I set it face down again, turned off the light, and let the quiet hold. The kind of quiet that doesn't demand anything from you. The kind that comes after you stop negotiating your worth and start deciding where your time actually belongs. I didn't announce anything. I didn't send a final message or make a show of stepping back. I just let the silence do its job. The first sign that things were changing came from someone I hadn't heard from in years. A distant cousin messaged me on social media, asking if everything was okay. She said she'd seen Brooke post something vague about family drama and boundaries and hadn't known what to make of it. I thanked her for checking in and kept my replies short. That was becoming a habit. Brooke's post grew more frequent over the next few days. Not direct. Never naming me outright. Just quotes about loyalty and family sticking together. Comments about people changing when they think they're better than everyone else. The kind of content that invited sympathy without inviting questions. People responded the way people always do. Some agreed. Some asked what happened. A few tagged others speculating quietly in the comments. What Brooke hadn't expected was the pushback. Someone asked why she'd skipped the ceremony if it mattered so much now. Another asked why she was posting about Pride after joking about concerts all week. One person mentioned seeing the earlier group chat screenshots circulating privately and said the situation seemed more complicated than Brooke was making it sound. That comment disappeared within minutes. At home, my parents tried a different angle. My mom called and left a voicemail saying she didn't like how things were being perceived. She said people were asking questions. She said it felt uncomfortable being put in the middle. I listened to the message once and deleted it. At work, nobody mentioned any of it. That separation held firm. My world there continued to function on a different set of rules, ones that didn't bend based on social pressure or family dynamics. During a late afternoon meeting, someone referenced a change in protocol that had come directly from an assessment I'd contributed to months earlier. It wasn't framed as a win, it was framed as progress. That distinction mattered. When I got home that evening, there was a message from Brooke waiting in my inbox. She said she didn't understand why I was letting people think badly of her. She said I could clear things up easily if I wanted to. She said family should come first. I read it, then read it again. Clear things up. The phrase suggested there was confusion, not consequences. That everything could be fixed if I just step in and manage the optics. I didn't reply. The next day, my dad sent a message asking if I planned to come by for dinner that weekend. He didn't mention the argument or the boundary. He framed it like nothing had happened, like we could just reset without addressing anything. I looked at the message and felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Relief that I didn't have to explain why I wasn't going. I replied that I wouldn't be able to make it and wished them a good evening. No details, no apology. That was when the consequences stopped being theoretical. Brooke called later that night, voice-tight words clipped. She accused me of freezing her out on purpose. She said people were assuming things. She said she didn't deserve to look like the bad guy. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I said one thing. I told her I wasn't responsible for managing how her choices looked to other people. She went quiet for a moment, then said I'd changed. I agreed. After the call ended, I sat there longer than usual, letting the quiet settle. This wasn't a dramatic fallout. There were no ultimatums, no declarations, just the slow realization on her end that the dynamic she relied on wasn't available anymore. Over the next week, small things surfaced. A mutual friend mentioned that Brooke seemed frustrated lately. A neighbor told my mom she'd seen the ceremony clip and asked why no one had been there to support me. My parents deflected, offering vague explanations that didn't quite land. The story they wanted to tell didn't fit the facts anymore. I noticed how often Brooke tried to reframe the situation as a misunderstanding, something mutual and messy. What she couldn't explain was why she'd mocked the invitation in the first place, or why the pride had arrived only after strangers took notice. Those details lingered. At work, a junior officer stopped by my desk to thank me for some guidance I'd given her earlier in the year. She said it had helped her navigate a tough decision, and that she appreciated how clear I'd been about expectations. Clarity again. That night, I thought about how different my sister and I handled pressure. Brooke tried to manage perception. I focused on outcomes. One required constant attention. The other just required consistency. My phone buzzed less as the days went on. The family chat stayed muted. Direct messages slowed. Not because everything was resolved, but because the usual levers weren't working. Distance has a way of exposing who relies on proximity to maintain control. I didn't block anyone. I didn't announce new rules. I just kept living my life the way I'd chosen to, letting the silence draw its own conclusions. One evening, I scrolled through old photos on my phone, not out of nostalgia, but out of curiosity. There were moments of genuine warmth there, laughs that hadn't been staged, smiles that hadn't been measured. Those memories didn't disappear just because I'd stopped engaging in the present the same way. They just stopped being leverage. A message came in from Brooke near the end of the week. It was shorter than the others. She asked if we could talk sometime. No accusations, no demands, just the question. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't avoiding her. I was deciding what access meant now that the old expectations were gone. The answer didn't need to be immediate. The consequences she was feeling weren't something I'd planned. They were the natural result of stepping back and refusing to carry what wasn't mine anymore. For years, I'd absorbed the discomfort to keep things smooth. Now the discomfort had shifted, and watching that happen confirmed something important. Boundaries don't punish people. They reveal how much someone was benefiting from the lack of them. I put the phone down and went back to what I'd been doing, letting the moment pass without turning it into a statement. The quiet continued to work in the background, steady and unbothered, reshaping the space between us without asking for permission. The email came in during a late shift, sandwiched between routine updates and a calendar reminder I'd already acknowledged. The subject line was plain nothing that asked for attention. I opened it because that's what you do when something lands in your inbox with your name on it. It was from a junior officer I'd worked with months earlier. She wrote to say she'd used a framework we'd talked through during a long afternoon briefing, and that it had helped her make a call she'd been second-guessing. She thanked me for being direct, and said it made a difference, knowing someone had her back without needing credit. I read it twice, then archived it. That kind of message didn't come with fanfare. It didn't need to. It was the kind of confirmation that stayed with you longer than applause ever could. Outside the building, the night was quiet. The parking lot lights cast the same dull glow they always did, and the air felt cooler than I expected. I sat in my car for a minute before starting the engine, letting the stillness settle. At home, my phone was where I'd left it. No new messages from my family. No missed calls. The silence had become familiar, less like absence and more like space. In the weeks that followed, life rearranged itself without drama. Work stayed demanding in the way it always had. New projects came in, old ones closed out. Responsibilities shifted slightly, as they do when people notice consistency and start relying on it. I went to dinner with coworkers who didn't ask me to explain why my job mattered. They already knew. We talked about mundane things about traffic and bad coffee and plans for the weekend. Nobody needed to impress anyone. Occasionally, fragments of my family life reached me through indirect channels. A neighbor mentioned my mom had framed a screenshot from the broadcast and hung it in the living room. A distant relative sent a message saying my dad talked about me often now, always emphasizing how proud he was. The story they told had changed. The facts hadn't. Brooke's online presence shifted too. She stopped posting vague quotes and started sharing neutral updates again. When my name came up, it was in passing. No tags, no performances, just distance.